Okay, so we're going to pick up on Nun Vav on the base down near the bottom. Let me just recap because we are a couple of weeks into this new sugya, this new Mishnah. We had been talking about Onah, then we digressed, but we're back really to focusing on Onah. But the Mishnah on Daf Nun Hey on the base talked about specific cases where there is no Onah. We were talking about cases where there is Onah. Now, this Mishnah flips the switch and says, these are the things of which there's no Onah, and it lists four things. And these are the main four that we talk about: Avodim, Shtoros, Karkos, the Hegdish, meaning servants, documents, land, and Hegdish. And without going into everything that we discussed, a lot of it has to do with the fact that the Torah says that Onah is on metaltalin, is on movable objects, which takes out karka, and we say avodim adoma lekarka, and also hegdish and shtoros. So, in other words, these are the four categories. Notwithstanding that there's some discussion later in the Mishnah where Reb Shimon adds a few and whatever, but these are the four. And so we have to understand what it means not to have oinah for these categories. So the Gemara went into various different discussions. And so we find ourselves now on Nun Vav on the base at the bottom. And the Gemara had just last week, we were started talking about the question of, for instance, what is mechubar lekarka? Remember, the whole issue is if it's part of the land, then there's no onah. If it's not part of the land, there is onah. So the Gemara asked an interesting question. Well, what about if you plant some seeds and they haven't yet sort of taken hold? Are they metaltalin? Because you can gather them and put them into a box, and then they would be metaltalin. Or is it already subordinate to the land? What's the nafkamina? Because if you want to sell something there, and it turns out that you're selling, for instance, seeds, and you didn't seed it enough. So the first part was that you said, I'm going to do 6 zuz, and you only did 5. The second interpretation was, I'm going to seed the whole field, and you wound up seeding 80% of the field without a specific number, because the number portion could be a problem. But let's just say, I'm going to seed this field, and you didn't seed the field. You paid me money for the seeds. Is it metaltalin because it hasn't taken hold? Therefore, there is onah, or is there not? So you see that even in this discussion of karka, we have to sort of break it down and say, what is karka? What is really land and what is not land? Because it makes a big difference as to whether or not there's onah. So that's kind of where we are, generally speaking. So now we're going to go into the next, there's a couple of other questions that have to be addressed. And this is an interesting one because it's an offshoot of that. We start with Omer. It's the first word of the 4 lines from the bottom. Omer matira ein matira. What is Omer? The Torah tells us that when you plant, you can't eat until the first Omer is harvested around Pesach time. And then when you harvest the Omer, then everything that's in the land at that point, it can be eaten. So again, we're going to distinguish what's in the land at the time of the Omer. Because if something is in the land, but it's not really in the land, by definition, halachically, then you can't eat it. You got to wait till the whole year till the next Omer. So this becomes a very important point to understand what's already in the field that the Omer is allowing you to eat. Says the Gemara, Omer matir ein matir. Does the Omer matir, does it permit eating seeds or food that's in the land or not? So what is it? Hey, Chadami. So the Gemara wants to say, what's the kasha? How do we understand this question? Ida ashru, if you say that the seeds that you planted have taken root, right? It's already in the ground when you brought the Omer. Says the Gemara Tanina. What's the chiddush? We learned in the Mishnah that how the seeds are treated. In other words, what's the chiddush that you're now telling me in this Gemara that I don't know from the Mishnah in Menachos that already tells me what the halacha is? Either lo ashrush, and if you say that the seeds are not implanted, meaning that they are what? Metaltalin. Tanila, we also learned that in the Mishnah. So the kasha here is, the Gemara says that Omer can be matir. And we understand that's the question. What does it mean? And the Gemara is asking, why are you bringing us down here, this whole discussion? We have this before. We've seen before with the Gemara in another Masechta asks a question that it has already been clearly identified in somewhere else. So again, there's a connection to the entire Shas. So when the Amoraim are learning the Gemara, they have this vision. They understand what's already been discussed, not been discussed, and again, unlike maybe the Mishnah or even the Torah, they expound a little bit wider than just the narrow discussion of the Mishnah, so that we give them latitude, because that's what the Gemara is about, expounding that which the Mishnah says, which sometimes is not totally clear. So if it's not clear or there's some ambiguity, the Gemara expounds on it. Here, the Gemara is saying, what are you telling me? You want me to have a discussion about Omer, and the whole thing was already discussed in another Mishnah. So what are you referring to? So what's the Mishnah? So we said the Mishnah was a Menachos. What's the Mishnah? And the Mishnah says, Beferish, Mishrishu, Kodem la Omer. If the seed was already rooted in the ground before the Omer Matirin, the Omer is matir, because what do we say? That anything that's in the ground becomes permissible. So, from last Pesach to now, you've already harvested, you've done a lot of stuff, and you're ready to eat it, so you have to bring the korban Omer. Now, a month before Pesach, you planted seeds. So, if these seeds are already, now you clearly are not going to harvest them for many, many months. But the harvesting is not the critical factor. The critical factor is, are they already in the ground? And we extrapolate that if they're in the ground, they're already permissible, even if the harvest is going to be months and months from now. So that's how you have to understand it. If they are Tishrishu Kodem Omer Matirin, this is the Mishnah, then the Omer is Matir. The Imlab, and if they're not rooted into the ground, Asura Machiyava or Mahabal, then they are not permitted because they're considered not yet part of the ground. Therefore, 6 months from now, you're going to harvest them. You can't eat it. You got to now wait for the next Omer, which will come a year later. I mean, maybe half a year from the time you harvest it. But clearly, if it was rooted in the ground, then you could automatically eat it 6 months after you brought the Omer, because the Omer already sort of kashed it. So that's what the Mishnah says. So if that's what the Mishnah says, what are you being mechadish here when you talk about the Omer and our Gemara? So in other words, there's got to be something else here if you're going to bring it down to our Gemara that isn't already stated once before. Okay? So the Gemara now has to find the root cause of why this Omer discussion in our Gemara is relevant. So this says the Gemara, this is why I bring it down, because what I'm about to say is not in the Mishnah. Like Tzricha, it's necessary to say it, right? The Chatzdinu v'Zarinu Kodem LaOmer. So this is an interesting twist. A farmer harvested his grain. He can't eat it until the Omer. We know that. But what did he do? But he took the grain and he sort of, winnowed it or whatever he did, and shook out the kernels that would be the seeds for the next Omer. In other words, this is self-perpetuating. Once you have wheat, I'm not a farmer, and maybe some of you know this, well, I grew up on a farm, but not a wheat farm, is that when you have food that throws off seeds, what you do is, you don't have to go buy seeds in the market. You take the seeds and you plant them. So you take the wheat that you want to eat, and the rest of it doesn't get thrown away. It gets reintroduced to the ground and is the source for the next harvest. Says the Gemara, you know why we're talking about Omer here? Because our situation is not what the Mishnah says. Our situation is where he harvested before the Omer, so the Omer can clearly take hold. And then he took those seeds from the harvest and he replanted them in the ground. The question now becomes, are those seeds also included in the Omer? We know that what he harvested is included in the Omer because that's clear. And that's what the Mishnah says. But we're departing from the Mishnah by taking it one step further, and we're saying you took the seeds and you planted them, and then says the Gemara, Omer v'cholef. So the Omer came while they were in the ground. So below Ashrish Kodem Omer, but they hadn't yet rooted. They hadn't yet become part of the ground. So, in other words, you harvested them, and before Pesach you planted them, and then you gave the korban Omer. Now, what do you do with the seeds that are in the ground? Are they permissive or not?
Rabbi, how long does it take to take root?
So that's a good question. How long does it take to take root? So that's a cheshbon that maybe there are. In other words, the Gemara doesn't give us a black letter here and say it's a month or 3 months. It could be dependent on the seed. So you now the farmer has to know based on his experience when it is already rooted. That's the question. That's a good point. So the
is this the normal? Rabbi, is this the normal?
Go ahead.
Is this the normal season for putting seeds in?
Yes. Yeah. In other words, yes. In the spring, you put it in, and then you let it right. That's Chodesh Aviv, around Pesach, and then after Sukkot, it's already about 6 months or so. Then you go ahead and harvest it. So if you harvest it, then was it part of the ground? Was it not part of the ground? Okay. So the kasha is, in other words, David, to your point, can you take these seeds out after you plant them, and can you eat them? In other words, are they edible the way you left it, right? So if it's edible the way you left it, then the Omer should redeem it, because why is it different than the actual stalks that you are allowing the Omer to redeem? The seed should also be redeemable because you can eat them. I guess seeds were something that people could eat, right? It wasn't just something that the ground. So that we can't learn from our Mishnah. The Mishnah Menachos doesn't talk about that. It tells us what we need to know, but now the fine point is, okay, you're planting it, and we know that if it can be taken out of the ground, if it hasn't rooted yet. But what does it mean to be rooted? So now you can take these seeds and still take them out. Maybe it takes a month for them to take root, and so you can eat them up to, let's say, 30 days. Again, Gemara doesn't give us the timeline, but abstractly we're saying that whatever that timeline is it enough to be included in the Omer or not included in the Omer? So that's the question here, different than what we had in the Mishnah, and that's what the Gemara is inquiring, right? So to understand that, now the Gemara says that there are two shittas in this. There are two ways of looking at this question. Okay, Kaman desharin bechada dami, v'shemino oimer. So then we use the same measure that we said before. Can you collect them and put them into a box so that they're really metaltalin, and metaltalin, there is oino, right? V'shemino omer, and just like there is oino because it's metaltalin, then coupled with that, the omer can allow you to eat them because they're still metaltalin. And we know that the halacha is that metaltalin are subject to ono, but not karka. O dilma, or maybe not, but lino agavara. Maybe they're bottled in the ground, like that Mishnah says. So in other words, the question is a little bit different. The principles that we use are the same, but the question is different. So, and for the Gemara, teku. So it's very interesting that teku, of course, we don't have an answer. So so now you dig a little bit deeper and you ask yourself, okay, if it's clear, like in the Mishnah Menachos, what the question is, there's no teku. But if we go one step further to this discussion, there is a teku. So you have to think about that and parse it. Why in the Mishnah, which talks about the same issue, right? Whether the Omer is matir or not depends on whether or not it's metalpul or not.
Rabbi, can I
Go ahead,
ask?
Michael.
I'm not sure I understand the question. So the seeds that come out, if the seeds were edible, then there would be no question that you could eat the seeds because they came out with the harvest.
Correct.
So we're not talking about the seeds themselves because they had already come out of the ground as part of the harvest. If I understand correctly, the question is if you replanted those seeds, the question is if they came up before the next Omer, during the Omer period, would they be allowed to be eaten, the harvest allowed to be eaten down the road, and or not? Because
Well,
you don't know when they
when you
took
say
the ground,
came
but the
up, I'm not
seeds
sure what you meant by
themselves are not the question, right?
I don't know what you mean by came up when you said that the seeds came up.
Well, I think that's one of the issues is that we need to define what makes it. Is it that you see something coming out of the ground? Is that if you digged it up, you'd see roots? What does it
Right.
mean that it's,
that it's taken root, that it's taken hold, right?
But I just want to clarify: when you took the original harvest out before the Omer, and you shook the seeds out,
right?
Those seeds you could eat. If they were edible seeds,
absolutely.
You could eat them.
Correct.
Okay. So
correct.
The issue is only regarding replanting those seeds at what?
Correct.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure I
understand. No, you're 100% right. It's replanting the seeds for the next harvest, and the kasha is if it's already planted for the next harvest, then it isn't ready now for the Omer to redeem it.
Right.
Omer can only redeem that's which harvested.
So what does it need to do? And the answer is teku, but there obviously it's a legitimate question because if you had an early harvest and you planted them before,
right,
and if they took root, you could certainly consider that you could take part of that before the next Omer.
Right. But what I'm pointing out is this is a teku, but the Mishnah in Menachos is not a teku. The Mishnah in Menachos, which just clearly states, if you say it's metaltalin, okay, then you can eat it. If it's not metaltalin, then then you have to wait to the next Omer. But we've changed the facts on the ground here, right? And we've said a little bit different than what the Mishnah Menachos is. Now, that little difference, that's the chiluk between that and us. And in this case, teku. When you change the facts,
right,
now we have a teku.
Right. But I just want to understand the facts of the case. And
Absolutely. So in other words, we're not sure, the upshot is, we're not sure in this scenario whether there is oino or not. The whole thing has to do with oino. So can there be oino in this particular case if you've overcharged, or is there not oino? So that's really the fascinating discussion and the difference. And the Gemara says teku, that we don't have an answer to it. I mean, we can posit all kinds of theories, but it's.
But it's a practical issue, Rabbi. I mean, is there a practical halacha on this? I mean, realistically, you could. So, for example, you have ownership issues, like if you're in the Yovel year or whatever. I mean, there are practical consequences to what happens.
Well, a lot of this is obviously it's mitzvahs hatluis ba'aretz, and a lot of them are tied to the Beis Hamikdash. So if you don't have a Beis Hamikdash, then as a practical matter, it's a theoretical discussion. What would it be in the event there was a Beis Hamikdash? What we would do? Well, then we would.
But some of it still does apply.
Some of it applies.
So Meiser and Truma, we do this, a penny, nickel, whatever kind of a thing. We play a game, so in a sense, to deal with it because we don't have any other way to deal with that the Beis Hamikdash. But Shemitah is very much every Shemitah year. We get all these rules of when the different fruits and vegetables and so on, when you're allowed to eat them, when you have to treat it special because of Shemitah. So that does apply, and that ties to these.
No, so you're very right. So to that point, when you deal with Shemitah, the rabbis, I mean the poskim have to understand from the farmers what was done, when it was done, right? And whether or not it violates the Shemitah to use it, or did it really get implanted so it's not a Shemitah product? You're right. It raises some interesting questions, even Bisman Hazeh, as to how how medactic you are. And I guess many people who are more machmir will say that anything that was planted around that point in time, maybe we won't touch. That's why you have to, right? You have to have from the older produce so that you can clearly know that it was not touched by Shemitah, right? So this is a very complicated question of Bisman Hazeh in some respects. So, but nevertheless, the actual question is the answer is in doubt as to whether or not it is or it isn't. And you can be machmer or makel. This becomes the question: are you machmer or are you makel? Okay. So let's go back and see. We have a couple of Rashis to go over. So down on the bottom, Omer Matirin. But a dozen lines in the bottom. Kasol Kedakot Agadulin today Kimaboyale. He's asking the kasha and that which grows Olahochi Kamahada or the Ashrish Kodem La Omer. So then the question is, did it take root before the Omer as to whether or not you can use it? In fact, the Gemara Tanina, the Omer Mater Eskiduleim, right? Mesachtas Menachos. We already have this discussion. And there they already explained everything. So what are you introducing here that is already not known there? That was the kasha. So the Idalo Ashrush Bishas Abos Omer, again, he's defining if it had not taken root when the Omer came. Tanina, also a Mishnah, the Ein Omer Matirin. Omer is not matir, something that didn't take root. So again, this goes to the question of what do you mean mechadish here in this Gemara that we already don't know from the Mishnah there, right? The Chatzvino min hachodosh or yitzrichin sheyasem omer la'achila. Okay, again, we say that the definition is that this is all raw grain, and it requires the korban omer, just like we have by fruit trees, neta ravai, where you have to leave the first 3 years and you can't eat it, and then you bring the neta ravai in the 4th year to Yerushalayim. So this is very interesting because this is consistent with everything the Torah tells us as people, is that we need to show restraint. In other words, we don't chap. The whole Torah is about doing things in a way that show, a certain, not only savlanut as we call it, but also you think about what belongs to the Rebbeinu Shalom, the whole world. The Rebbeinu Shalom is giving us permission to eat from his produce. So there are different rules for different food, how you eat. Otherwise, it's Gzela. You're taking from Rebbeinu Shalom, and we're going to see that discussion now when we go further, that you're taking it properly from the Rebbeinu Shalom. Therefore, all these mitzvahs, we can't make light of them because really the Rebbeinu Shalom is asking, he's giving us all of this, but he's asking one thing from us: do it in a fashion that I have presented to you. So the Omer is, it's lucky it's only a year and not 3 like other fruits, because the Omer is the harvest that people rely on much more so than in the case of fruits. This is the backbone of what everybody uses on a daily basis, right? The wheat, the barley, the chamisha minim that you have in Eretz Yisrael. That's really the sustenance that Klal Yisrael had and continues to have probably in Israel. You see all these these ads that we all see about how the farmers have been devastated, which they have during the last year plus, and then how it's affected the prices and the availability of food in Eretz Yisrael. This is clearly a case where you can see the hand of the Rebbeinu Shalom. But even so, even in these difficult times, there are mitzvahs, fluyas ba'aretz, that people who understand are mekuyim. So that is very much the part of what we're talking about. So on the top of Nun Zayin, ma'alamiket me'elu mechel, can you eat from this? Klomer, agedulin today from these growths. Lo maboyle shahari afilu het Fila heta omer shalosh gaded esesroim kodem shenizru rezarim kodem omer v'lo hishrishu havagidulim lasurim. In other words, what he's saying is that which comes out and is clearly food, we have no question, right? That's what we've been saying because we know that it's food. But it's what we don't understand or don't know about that which has been planted, right? Kodem Shamar, before you see them, Bazaram Kodem Omer, Loishrishu, have a Hagadulin Osurim Achiyava Oimahabo. So again, the fine point is that in other words, I think Michael, you may have asked the question. If you see a shoot coming out of the ground from something that you planted, I don't know, 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, and now the Omer comes, you can pretty safely say that that's a Gedulim in Haaretz, and it should be okay even if you harvest it 6 months later. It's what you don't see, right? You don't see, and I guess the mysteries of agriculture were such, David, that they could not say with certainty that 30 days in it's already Gedulim in a karka or not. Right? Today we probably could know in an instant with all kinds of scientific measurements. Is this seed already part of the ground? I'm sure we can do that.
Lahavdil, but it's actually not, in certain ways, not so far different. This brings to mind the whole question of questions surrounding abortion and related issues, which is at what point does it turn from a mass of cells to a fetus to an embryo,
Something
fetus,
right,
etc.
right.
It's plant, so it's a very different issue. The ramifications are very different, but it's a similar kind of thing where there are all these disagreements, both halachically and in the secular world and so on, of what defines, in this case,
What defines life here, or what defines right?
When does it turn from a seed to a plant? Let's
to
say,
a plant, and what is that part? Right. So clearly, the Gemara wasn't interested in telling us that because that was secondary to the discussion of whether or not it's considered planted. So whatever that timeline is for planting, that's what we're talking about. So now, in some cases, maybe the seed already breaks the at a point where you can say, oh, it's already for sure grown. And if you can see it, then there's no question. It's when you can't see it and you have to sort of surmise, is this really already rooted in the ground? So what the Gemara tells us, what we said before is, one of the tests is, can you dig it up and are the seeds still edible because they're part of the grain? In other words, seeds themselves, the way I understand it, they decay, right? They decay, become part of the ground, and that is the push to the next growth. But they have to decay first. They have to, in other words, once they decay, they're not edible. So the Gemara says, in this particular says, can you take them out and eat them? Right? If you can eat them, then it's considered part of the previous harvest. The Omer makes it mutter, and it's subject to oh no. All of those things happen.
Sounds
if it's already decayed, then it's not edible. And if it's not edible, the Omer does not liberate it, and it's considered karka, so you can't have no. There's no no on karka.
Rabbi, I'm confused. So help me here. So if you said, on the one hand, if it sprouts, it is in the ground and is taken hold in accordance with the Mishnah that you quoted earlier, and so therefore it's clearly growing, and when it harvests, which will be well before the next Omer in all likelihood, you can take part of it. If the seed has taken root and there's growth there, the seed in its former form is not existent because it's already grown. So when you dig it up, you could transplant it, but you can't get the old seed. So is it that if you actually see visible growth, it can be part of the current Omer, the earliest Omer, and take part of it? But in the other quote you made, that if if it's the seed, you still can use it. I don't understand, because if it's grown, the seed no longer exists as a seed. There are roots. You're on mute, Rabbi. You're on mute, Rabbi. Still on mute. Now you're good.
Oh, okay, I must have pressed something. Okay, so to your point, Michael, there's a visual test and a non-visual test. The visual test clearly is if it breaks the ground, we say that it's already a growth. And if it's a growth, then it's definitely part of the Omer. And all the ramifications of Ono, everything works.
Okay.
That's pretty straightforward.
Okay.
The question is, if you don't see it, is it automatically not, or can it still be? And that's what the Gemara, in our Gemara here, talks about when it says, can you dig it up and still eat it? Clearly, clearly it's not already growing, because we would see
Right.
the growth. But the question is it already fermenting in the ground to the point where I can no longer eat it? Decayed. I can't no longer eat it. Even if I don't see it, it's already part of the ground, and therefore we have to consider it already gedula min hakarka. But if you can take it out and it's not decayed, you can still use it, then we say it's metaltalin. It's not already embedded in the ground. So the standard is both a visual and a non-visual test, and the Gemara tells us the non-visual test is, can you dig it up and eat it?
But,
If you can
but
dig it
let
up.
me make sure I understand correctly. I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself. So if there's a growth, it's the beginning of the growth, and it will emerge that it grows through its normal gestation period.
Right.
And when you harvest it, it will be before the next Omer,
But you can eat it.
considerably, because it's this early. You can use it as part of the current Omer and don't have to wait till the next Omer.
Correct.
What you're
Correct.
saying is that if it still is in a seed form, you could eat the seed form if you dug it up and it's still a seed form. But if the seed has not kept its form and it has not emerged from the ground, then you can't eat it.
Right.
But the seed itself, if you can dig up the seed, you can still eat it, because it was part of the other harvest where it was in the form of a seed.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
I just want to make sure I got
So the
all
question
the
is, where do you draw the line? If you literally put the seed in the ground and 5 minutes later said, "Oh, you know what? I want to eat some beans for dinner," and you pull it right back out, obviously it's fine. A day later, a week later, a month later, where do you draw the line?
Yeah.
Right. Right. So that was the mystery of agriculture that they didn't have. And therefore, they postulated, we're going to find certain simonim which will help us tell us whether or not it's in the ground or not in the ground. It may not be as scientific as we would like today, but it's the closest that we can come to understanding whether or not this is something that the Omer can
So, Rabbi, to your earlier point, the fact that science knows a lot more now, we can measure things more, has that made any difference in the interpretation of the halacha as it pertains to Shemitah, as to what the definition is, because there's more known today about?
I'm sure it has. I'm sure it has. If we were to, I'm sure that today in the scientific community in Eretz Yisrael, from people who look to these things, can get a halachic ruling based on what is actually happening. Because I have to imagine the technology today, I haven't read it, I don't know it, but I have to imagine can sort of define what's mechubal karka and what's not mechubal karka. I think today we can pretty safely say that we can understand that. And based on that, they give a psak that it's either Shemitah or not Shemitah. and you act accordingly. I mean, again, maybe there's some rabbanim who would take a more lenient tack to it because again, shmita is shmita. It is what it is. So if you go by the ruling, maybe of the Eida Achreides or whoever it is, then that's the definition of shmita. I'm not sure everybody agrees, but to the extent that you can have a unified opinion, if one can say this isn't growth of the sixth year. There's no question it's growth of the seventh year. If you can make that interpretation, then it's Shemitah. You can't use it. There's no question you can't use it. So I think it's fascinating how that applies to us today, because even though, many of these halachas don't, but halachas at Tluyas Ba'aretz certainly have a effect. Visharino Omer says Rashi she'omer mata as a pollution. The Omer is mata the tolush, that is which is not mechubel karka, right? Again, this is the point that you don't have to necessarily harvest today, as long as it's in the ground and already considered part of the ground. It's already covered by the carbon Omer, all right? Or says the Gemara, Dilma Batlina Agav Ara. In a karka ba'alma dami, it's just land, sand, land. V'lo shayach omer gabei l'mishmenu. And we can't say that there is an omer. The omer is not magical. The omer covers what's real, and what's real is that which you already can see is a growth. If it's just land, then you can't somehow reach some kind of a compromise and say, well, the Omer, maybe some things take longer to gestate than others. Michael, maybe some things take 2-3 months to gestate as opposed to others that take a month to gestate. So, in other words, in some cases, you may have certain foods that are already mechubel karka, and others that you planted at the same time that are not mechubel karka because they're not yet in the karka. They're not yet taken as a hold of the karka. So that's the question. But regardless of how it is, that's how we come out. So we come out with a teku that we just can't answer the question. Yeah, Jay.
What about when we have food being grown in water in Eretz Yisrael?
Well, that's a good question, because that's not mechubel karka. So and maybe that was the way around Shemitah to a certain degree, is that they started planting things not in the earth. And if it's not planted,
that you can watch.
You can watch.
See, in all of these ponds that they have all over Eretz Yisrael where they're growing food in water.
Okay, so that's a good question, because I'm not familiar with the halacha, but it would seem to me that the laws of Shemitah are laws and lands are tuli ba'aretz. If it's not ba'aretz, then I'm not sure it makes a difference whether
I've heard of that.
It already rooted or not.
Right, I've heard of that for Shemitah. Years ago, I used to hear of that. The hydroponics is a way around that. But but that still leaves open the question, even if that solves Shemitah, does that also affect the Omer type of issue? Does it also affect Trumas and Maestras? I mean, there's multiple things, and I don't know if they're all considered the same. They're all rooted in the same law basis.
But since we don't have,
I don't know.
Yeah, but since we don't have the Beis HaMikdash, a lot of these questions are moot. The question of Shemitah is, like you pointed out, is still Bisman Hazeh, but many of the others that require.
But even Chadash and Yashan, which I think because most, if I understand it correctly, which I might not, that because most would say that that was only in the first place D'Rabbanan outside of Israel, and therefore we don't worry about so much. But there are people in Machmir do, and Star K and others make lists each year around, as we get into the summer, of which things are what date certain things are considered chadash and therefore a problem. In Israel, that definitely is an issue. So knowing whether it applies or not, it still matters, because you get to eat it eventually, but you may not be able to eat it right away.
Right.
So I don't know.
But all of these interesting questions that come up today, and the rabbinate and certainly the Bali Halacha have to dig deep to understand what the halacha is and how you come about it. So that's very fascinating, and that's what again, the Gemara was the halacha at the time. We've now come centuries later, so that which the Gemara said today has been expounded upon many times with the Shulchan Aruch, and then poskim, even post Shulchan Aruch poskim who take the words of a little bit differently. So again, there's a lot to be said on this. A lot to be said. All right. So now with this teku, we kind of have the Gemara veers off a little bit. And the Gemara comes up with a different set of questions. You remember from our discussion many, many months ago, or from the beginning, that when we talked about Onah, there were categories of Onah, and if it was exactly 1/6, then you can't wipe out the Mekach, but you have to pay the Onah. 1/6 was the dividing line between whether or not the deal is alive or the deal folds. So up till now, the term onah that we use is 1/6, exactly 1/6. And the question is, do you pay the onah, not pay the onah? There's not been any discussion about whether or not the deal folds and then you get your money back. Now the Gemara wants to go one step further. The Mishnah that says that these things don't have onah, do they mean strictly 1/6, or do they also mean if it's more than 1/6, and we would come to say that you can wipe out the deal, maybe you can't wipe out the deal? In other words, since we're talking about cases that if it was onah in the positive sense that we said 1/6 is a divider, more than 1/6 it can implode. But now that we're talking in the negative, that these things don't have onah, the question becomes, do they not have only onah? What about if the deal is more than onah? Does that change with these four categories, with karka and shtoris and hegdish and avodim? Maybe if it's more than 1/6, the rules of onah don't apply, and you can wipe out the deal, so to speak. If you sell an eved, you can't. There's no onah. But wait a minute, if you sell him for $1,000 and the value is 100, that's not onah. That's already, as the Gemara is going to say, that's a mekach tos. That's a totally different situation. That's a deal that doesn't get off the ground because it's totally. Onah means I under or overvalued something. I'm still in the parsha, but I overvalued it. Okay, so the Torah tells us that you should not do that, but I'm going to give you leeway up to 1/6. But if I sell you something, and it's not a question of value, I have totally missed the boat. I'm selling you something for $1,000 that really only sells for 100. That's not a no. That is way beyond. That's what we call a mekach tos. That is a mistaken sale, and a mekach tos will always be undone. But the question is, does that apply among these four categories? It applies to other things we know, but does it apply what the Mishnah says here? There's no onah. Is there also not mekach tos? And that's what the Gemara says. Amar Rabba, Rav Chasa. Rabba says the name of Rav Chasa. Boy Rav Ami. Rav Ami asked this question. Onah ein lohem. We know that this Mishnah tells us that there's no onah for this category. Bittul mekach yesh lahem or ein lahem. What about bittul mekach, which we call mekach tos? Bittul mekach means you didn't just make a mistake. You blew the roof off. You made a deal that should never have made because the buyer didn't know or the seller didn't know. They were totally isolated. So they said, "I'll sell you this for 100. It should be 1,000. I'll sell it to you for 1,000. Should be 100." So, in other words, you're talking about way out of line, not just values. That's the kasha. But does that apply to our Mishnah where there's no onah? Does the lack of onah already cover mekach tos? That's what the Gemara now is going to peel off and want to discuss as to whether or not. So how do we look at this? Okay, so we'll get started, and there's a lot more to this, but this is the question. Amar Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman says, Hoda Amar Rav Chasa. After asking the question, Rav Chasa said, remember, Rav Chasa is saying that Rav Ami asked it. So Rav Chasa said, Poshet Rav Ami or no ein lahem bittul mekach yesh lahem. Rav Chasa reconsidered the question was brought to him. What's the halacha by mekach tos? So he said, you know what? Rav Ami already, okay, so he's saying that Rav Chassid said Rav Ami already considered that. And he said, I know ein lohem, categories is no or no. Bittul mekach yesh lohem. But bittul mekach, there is. So in other words, you ask me the kasha, I'm right away going to give you the answer that in Rav Ami's query, he already basically understood the question and understood the answer that oino means oino, literally, but it doesn't mean mekach tos. It doesn't mean bittul mekach. So in the case where you violate well beyond 1/6, just like in the Gemara that we have earlier on, where ono does apply, but you can't undo the deal because it's only a 6. More than a 6 you can undo. He says the same is true where there is no ono, but that's just in the sphere of 1/6. Once you get out of 1/6, then spittel mekach, and even in the case of the karka, for instance, which clearly is the source of all of these issues, you can undo a sale if the sale was so egregious that it went beyond 1/6. So this is the Gemara, and the Gemara asks the question, and the Gemara says, no, Rav Ami already understood the answer. Okay, so fine. Now, but parallel to this, there was a discussion between other Amoraim of whether or not this question and answer applied only to some of the category, not all of the category. Remember, we have 4 categories in the Mishnah of Ein no, right? We have karka, we have shtar, we have hektish, and we have evet. So on the face of it, Rav Ami is saying, "Ono ein lahem bittul mekach yesh lahem," and he doesn't distinguish. He doesn't say some are ono, some are. Some are mekach, some are not mekach. Came the Amoraim, the other Amoraim, and Rabbi Yochanan said, "You know what? There is a difference. Not all of them fall into the category of mekach tos, and we'll explain." So now what's the machlokes? So let's understand the machlokes. Rabbi Yonah Omar. Rabbi Yonah says that in Rabbi Yochanan, who also says regarding our Mishnah that mekach tos does not apply, that you can undo the sale. There's a machlokes what Rabbi Yochanan meant. Says Rabbi Yonah Omar, a hegdish. Rabbi Yochanan only meant by hegdish there's a mekach tos. Rav Yirmiyah Amar are karkos. Rav Yirmiyah comes and says, no, that when he said there was a mekach tos, he meant by karka, not by hegdish. And we're going to see in a minute what this discussion is about. But so the Gemara is really saying, okay, you gave me a general answer, but that general answer now has to be parsed because he didn't mean to say that it applies. Yes, mekach tos applies, but where? Now we're going to get into a finer discussion about where mekach tos applies. So that's the discussion now in the Gemara, based on what Rabbi Yochanan said. So Rabbi Yonah says hegdish, Rabbi Yirmiyah says karka. But the Travayo, both of them, Mishmei Rabbi Yochanan Amru, they both agree, ono ein lahem bittul. They both agree that the ono doesn't apply. In other words, this isn't going to be a carryover to ono. We've already put that to rest. That neither hektish or karka or the others have ono. Ono ein lahem, but bikul metach yesh lahem. But they both agree that there is mekach tos. Okay, so here it's a little bit of an ambiguous question. We started out by saying Rabbi Yochanan says that mekach tos doesn't apply, and there's now a discussion in the interpretation of Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yonah says that where there's no mekachtos is on hegdish, and Rabbi Yirmiyah says it's on karka. But then he says, you know what? As a general rule, what Rabbi Yochanan meant is there is no ono, that ono doesn't apply, but mekach, bittul mekach, yesh lahem, but there is bittul mekach. So it's a little bit ambiguous what's going on here, because on the one hand, we're saying that Rav Ami said that there is that there is a mekach tos, and Rabbi Yochanan agrees with him. Rabbi Yochanan agrees with him that mekach tos undoes the deal, ono doesn't. And then the Gemara says, but wait a minute, but there is now a machlokes what Rabbi Yochanan meant when he said ein lohem that bittul mekach yesh lohem. Does he mean everything or only some things? So that's the ambiguity of our Gemara right now, is we don't understand what is Rabbi Yochanan saying. Is bittul mekach on everything, or is it not? He agrees with Rav Ami, who then said that bittul mekach yesh lahem, but the interpretation in Rabbi Yochanan is, oh no, not so fast. It doesn't go to everything. So it's not clear right now what Rabbi Yochanan is saying. Is he saying that there is bittul mekach on everything? Or like Rabbi Yonah says, only on hegdish, and Rabbi Yirmiyah says only on karka. So now that's what the Gemara have to go into a little bit further. So let's start that. Manda oma a hegdish. Okay, so now we're going to parse the words. Rabbi Yonah, who says that it goes on hegdish, kolshkein are karkos. If hegdish doesn't apply, kolshkein are karkos, then of course karka. We'll explain that in a minute. Manda oma karkos, but Rabbi Yirmiyah, who says that Rabbi Yochanan's interpretation of mekach tos is only on the land, aval hegdish lo, but for hegdish there is no mekach tos. So we're gonna have to understand what this means. So we'll go one step further and then we'll explain. Kiddush Shmuel, the Omar Shmuel. So what is he basing it on? He's basing it on the words of Shmuel, Hegdish Shavamana, who says that if you brought a carbon and it was worth a money, that was the value of the carbon, but you wanted to be mechala. The halacha is that when you bring a carbon, you can't be mechala the carbon. If it's a valid carbon, you can't undo it. When can you undo it? Let's say you brought a carbon and the carbon had a blemish, right? The carbon then had a blemish. You can't bring the carbon. What do? Now you're allowed to substitute it for something else, only because you can't bring it. So let's say the carbon that you brought was worth a money, and now it's accidental. It fell and accidentally broke a leg. You can't bring the carbon. Says the Gemara, Shechilu al shove pruta. You then exchange it for an animal that you bought for a pruta. A mana is what? $100. A pruta is $1. So let's just say. So you're clearly paying a lot less for the same animal, but you're exchanging animals. Says Shmuel. So what do you think? You think it should be good? Okay. Is it valid to take an expensive animal that now has to be redeemed and redeem it for something that is merely pennies? Can you do that? So the logic seems to be no. Comes Shmuel and says mechulol. He says yes, you can. If you can find an animal and it's less expensive, you're not beholden to spend the entire money on the carbon. You can halal the carbon and bring something less.
Okay? The accident takes it away from being the standard of what you have to pay for.
No, but you decided the standard by saying I'm bringing a carbon and I happen to pay a money for the carbon. There's nothing in the Torah that says you have to pay a money. You just have to bring a carbon. You brought a nice carbon for a money, and then all of a sudden the carbon broke a leg, and now you got to replace it.
Right, so you can replace it at any value because
that's what Shmuel says. Yeah, not everybody agrees.
This accident eliminated it from the discussion.
Oh, but Shmuel is not. There's a machlokes here.
Yeah.
Those who say it's very nice that you brought another carbon, but you got to bring it to the same equivalent of what the
Same
carbon you
value
brought.
that you
Right.
intended to.
So Shmuel says no. So now
So
let's
the
stop and think a
intention,
minute.
so it goes back to the intention when you started the whole story. You intended to bring a valuable carbon and it got damaged on the way, so you still have to replace it with the same value is what the argument is.
Correct. That's the opposing view. But
Because you
that's what you see
designated
in-
that particular animal. If you
What's
just
that?
because you designated that particular animal, if you just said an animal, you could bring any other kind of animal, right?
Right, right. But let's say he dedicated a sheep, and he went to the marketplace. He bought the fattest, nicest sheep, and it was worth a money. Okay, the sheep falls, breaks a leg. He says, "Oh my gosh, I've got to go find another sheep." He goes into the marketplace, finds another sheep, looks pretty good to him, and the guy says, "I'll sell it to you for pruta." Again, and he says, "I'll buy it." He buys the thing, and he comes to me and makes us very happy that he's found a nice fat sheep replacing his carbon. So, according to Shmuel, the Gizber says, "Very nice. What did you pay for this?" And he says, "I paid a pruta." He says, "No, no, no, no. That's not okay, right? We have valued your first carbon at a mana, and now you're going to pay a pruta." Shmuel says, "Machalel, that you can do the deed. You can't bring the other carbon. It's gone. It's broken, but." You don't have to go back out and look for a sheep that's worth a mana. You found a nice sheep, all right, and you can bring it. This is not the story of Cain and Hevel, where he went on the cheap and he brought something that wasn't from the best of meaning. Here he bought something that was very nice, just happened to be not as expensive. Maybe the prices dropped because it's supply and demand. I mean, we don't know, but it doesn't matter, says Shmuel. At the end of the day, Machalel, you can deconsecrate the one and use the other.
So, Rabbi, I just want to clarify. So
Yeah.
means forget the value, the quality of the animal. Obviously, it has to meet a certain level for hectare.
Correct.
But as long as it meets the quality, and obviously there are distinctions in quality, but if it
Right.
meets the quality to substitute for the other,
Right.
Shmuel's opinion is that regardless of what it costs, you
Right.
can substitute another animal.
Right. That's Shmuel. But
So
we're going to now.
why does the other side say it's got to cost as much or more?
Okay, so we'll get to that. We'll get to that. But to your point, you're absolutely right. Shmuel says, "I'm not looking at the money." But wait a minute. This whole discussion is about the money. Was there a mekachtos here? In other words, did the guy sell him something and it was so egregious that he can back out of the deal? In other words, we're looking at the money aspect, not at the quality. Qualitatively, we're saying he bought a beautiful sheep. But if he paid so much less than Oinah, is there a mekachtos that applies
But
here?
there's so many factors that go into that. How do you measure that? If he bought it in a different part of the country where animals were less, but the quality was the same, and he went out there and got it, what difference does it make? I mean, do you have to actually pay the guy more than he's asking to make it equivalent?
That's what the Gemara is saying. That somehow,
That's
if
the machlokas.
somehow if you're the price differential, whether you bought it in Bavel or you bought it in I don't know you bought it in I don't know outside of what we consider Eretz Yisrael, and then you bring it to Eretz Yisrael, you bring it to Yerushalayim, and then you want to redeem it, and all of a sudden you say I need a different animal, regardless of the location, Michael. The point is, what are you going to spend on it? That's the focus. What are you going to spend on it? And are you going to spend on it a price point of which the differential is a mekachtos? In other words, it doesn't matter if it's the same quality, according to Shmuel. I mean, according to Shmuel, it just matters that you're replacing it. It doesn't matter what it costs.
With the same quality, but not the same quality, because hectares.
Oh yeah, you have to give the same quality. But
I don't understand why.
Because you know what we're saying? We're saying that if the price for the same quality is so different, then he can go back to the seller and say, you cheated me because you sold me something that was so far more expensive than what is the norm.
But
That's
you
what
don't know the
point is.
timing is different. Whatever is different. The point is this taints the sacrifice. The sacrifice is for purity to get into this to mean. So then why don't you mandate to the donor, you've got to pay at least as much, no matter what the cost is, you got to pay at least as much for the next animal, regardless of what it is, and get off of this so you have it. So then you don't worry about this, because this is tainting the hekdesh. There's no reason it should get down to this level.
But you see, the counterpoint to Shmuel is that is really the market. The market was a money. So if you went out and spent a money, that would be correct. By not spending a money and being able to buy the same quality for much less than a sixth of, in this case, much less than a sixth of what you paid, it shows that what you paid was improper, because a quality carbon doesn't cost the money.
Yeah, but see, you don't know the timing of it. He could have bought
so
those
we'll
animals
see how
when
the
they were
Gemara
first
adjusts
born. He could have bought them in a group, and they assigned the value to it. It's just, it's bickering over. It's demeaning.
Right. So, Michael, you're introducing valid points, because the whole situation could be different. So I'm going to say, you're right. Let's say the situation is the same. For our discussion purposes, you're raising a good question. What happens if by the time he got there, the market changed and it doesn't have to be the same price? Those are all valid points. Let's hold them for now. Let's just compare apples to apples and say that he went up to Yerushalayim, and within a day or two, whatever it was that he was bringing, not 6 months later, not with a whole different market, he found the same animal for a pruta. And then he says, wait a minute, why did I pay him money? Notwithstanding your points, let's put your points aside for a minute. Why did I pay him money? I was cheated. It isn't a question of value. It's a question that I didn't even know, because I'm not knowledgeable, that in the marketplace, it doesn't cost the money. This guy cheated me. And he gave me something that
He told me a bill of goods. See,
told me a bill of goods.
So I'm going to say
but you're right. The points that you raise become influential to whether or not this is a mekach, because if it's a totally different situation and you can't compare apples to apples, then you can't argue mekach. You're 100% right.
And you're focusing on something that's detracting from the purity of the sacrifice. That's what you're there for. You're there to bring a korban, whether it's voluntary or required because you made a transgression. That's what the focus should be on, is that you're fulfilling God's will, not that you're trying to nickel and dime for money back.
I agree with Michael.
Again, that's why Shmuel points out that we're not looking at anything other than an even exchange. Qualitatively, if the exchange is equal, we're satisfied. So, to your point, Michael, those other issues may come up later as to whether or not you can compare the one carbon with the other carbon, totally different, and whatever it is, the other factors that you raise legitimately, whether or not those play into it. But in its purest form, we put that aside for a minute. We just ask ourselves, is there mekach when you take a carbon? And again, I'm going to emphasize carbon because of what we're about to say. In the case of a carbon, you take an animal, the animal doesn't work, you replace it with another animal. Is there mekach? So let's just hold the rest of it for a minute, because Shmuel's reasoning, I'll tell you, because we're going to go into this next week. So Shmuel says, by hekdesh, there can never be a mekach. Why? Because it's the Rabbeinu Shalom's carbon. In other words, mekach, this is really going to take you, mekach will apply between me and you. if I sell you something, Jay, or I sell you something, Michael, and it's way beyond what it should be in price, then as between the two of us, there was I'll call it a fraud. There was a fraudulent sale, and therefore Mekach Tos applies. But by definition, by Hegdish, there cannot be a Mekach Tos because it's the Rabbanu Shalom's carbon, and there's no mistake.
Okay.
There's no mistake by the Rabbanu Shalom. That's why Rabbi Yonah says that I'm talking about Hegdish, you're talking about Karka, two different things. You can't say that because we know it by Hegdish, we know it by Karka. Hegdish is different. Hegdish has the Rabbanu Shalom as a partner. Different rules. Go ahead.
Rabbi, when Michael's point is that the man starts off, he lives in the suburbs, he has to bring a korban for whatever reason. He wants to bring a certain quality, to Hashem, and he buys one. And this thing, the deal goes bad. He breaks his leg or whatever, and he wants to replace for what he started off with. He's not looking to save money. He's looking to basically give the Hegdish the same beautiful korban that he had started out with in the suburbs. So why do we get into the whole discussion of the money? The money's not the issue for this person who's bringing a korban. He'll pay whatever it costs because he wants.
And that's exactly, Jay, that's exactly what Shmuel says. Shmuel says the money is not the issue, it's the carbon, and therefore you can bring a carbon that's far less expensive than what you spent for the first one, because it's about the carbon, not the money. You hit it on the head.
Why would anybody argue with his intentions to make it consistent all the way to the end of the story? How can anybody argue with that?
Okay, so you have to stay tuned to see that there is a machlokes on Shmuel. That Shmuel has a very solid opinion, one that we all agree with here, and yet there is another opinion. So that we have to wait for. But to understand what the Gemara is about, the underlying principle, and I'm pointing this out because that's going to be a subject of a lot of discussion, is that Hegdish is different than everything else. Your partner in Hegdish is the Rabbanu Shalom. And by Rabbanu Shalom, there's no Mekach Tos, there is no fraudulent sale. Therefore, says Shmuel, the money doesn't matter. It's the carbon that matters. And if it's a good enough carbon, it's a comparable carbon, it's good. Again, postscript, we'll have to see the other side. But that's exactly the point. But that's why Rabbi Yonah says, Rabbi Yonah says, a Hegdish, that when Rabbi Yochanan made his statement, it was only on Hegdish, not on Karka. In other words, just because Rav Ami said, "Oh no, ein lohem bittul mekach yesh lohem," and it seems like it's bittul mekach means that all four categories of our Mishnah can be undone by bittul mekach. Says Rabbi Yochanan, no, we're not going to agree to that. Not by Hegdish. Hegdish has nothing to do with the others as far as bittul mekach. We're not talking about Arnoah, we're talking about bittul mekach. We wanted to understand whether because you don't have Arnoah, do you not have bittul mekach? So Rav Ami says, there isn't Arnoah, but these four categories have bittul mekach. So and Rabbi Yochanan, so in Rabbi Yonah's interpretation, only by Hegdish is there no bittul, no bittul mekach. But by Karka there is, because Karka is like everything else. That's inherently the answer. So this is the tip of the iceberg here, and it clearly is engendering a good discussion because logically we say Shmuel should be right. What do we care about the money? But in the world at large, there is a halacha. You can't commit fraud. And fraud means that you're overcharging or undercharging by more than a sixth. And we know that from way back in the Gemara. So because Karka or these other things don't have Onah, do they automatically not have Bittul Mekah? Says Rabbi Yonah, Hegdish doesn't have Bittul Mekah because you're dealing with the Rabbi Shalom. But Karka is a different thing. And again, and we're going to see the reverse. We'll hold that, but we're going to see that what's Pshat and Rav Yirmiyah, because Rav Yirmiyah says Karka, what about Hegdish? So bottom line, at least in our understanding, Hegdish is different. Why is it different? Because there's no fraud by the Rabbi Shalom. The Rabbi Shalom, if the Rabbi Shalom is accepting something for a pruta that someone else pentamana, that's not considered fraud, because by the Rabbi Shalom, like we say, it's about the carbon. And if the carbon was fine and passed muster because it was a beautiful carbon, what difference does it make how much you spent? But in the real world outside of Hagdish, it does matter. And you might argue, well, but you're buying something, again, in the case of Hagdish, it's because you want to give the best to the Rabbi Shalom. So we don't look at money. We say money is not a factor. The fact that one is a zuz and one is a mana is okay by the Rabbi Shalom. Mercer doesn't mind. He doesn't care. But between you and me, when I sell you or buy from you, I do mind. I do mind if I'm being taken for a ride, or we buy if I take you for a ride. No, that's not right. That's pshat mekach tos. So anyway, it's a fascinating discussion, but and we'll pick it up in much more detail. But you're all right Michael, when you ask that question, because l'chayra, the halacha should be like Shmuel. But we're going to see that there's a machlekes here, and we're going to understand the other side of the machlekes, why Shmuel is or isn't correct. So we'll pick up, but this is the direction the Gemara is going to go in, and hopefully next week we'll get a little further into it. But good
That's your cause,
discussion and good